Okay, and I'll check this real quick. Where's the go live? Hello? Is it just that? Yeah. There it is. There it is. Okay, cool. And, oh, it behaved this time. What do you know? All right. So we ended last time with the end of the Homestead strike and the video I showed you guys. And again, for you online folks, I couldn't show it on the stream because they would have like pulled the whole video. So I just left you guys a link on Blackboard for that, so you online folks can find it that way. So and just for everybody, there's another episode. It might have been earlier in that very same one, The Men Who Built America, where I think it was like Carnegie and Rock. It was all the big wigs of the time. They built this. It was like some country club out. I think it was in Tennessee. And they built this dam to have their own little private lake. And long story short, the dam wasn't up to code, and they demanded that it be widened so that they could get their carriages across. And due to a rainstorm and them attempting to work on the dam while it was still under construction, the dam broke and flooded the entire town and killed like thousands of people. And it was actually like the worst technically natural disaster, but like man-made natural disaster in at least American history, potentially world history. And it was because of a bunch of rich assholes wanting their own lake. So, yeah, it's not something that's normally talked about, but it was a huge deal. All right. So, yeah, this is where we ended with the Pinkertons and Frick getting shot in the neck, and eventually the state militia coming in and putting down the strike. And we've got the map and Pinkertons and all this. So this wasn't the only strike that happened. I mean, there were a lot of strikes, but most of them didn't get nearly this bad. The Pullman strike is the other one of note. And while it did get somewhat violent, what's really to note here was the cause and how Pullman ended up ending it, as opposed to how Frick tried to put down what was going on at Homestead. So again, Pullman had the Pullman Palace Car Company. You know, they were running the those fancy train cars. So he considered himself a friend of the workers, and again, at least while times were good, working at his factory wasn't a horrible deal. I mean, again, it wasn't great, but you tended to make enough to survive. And because the factory was so large, because again, you were building train cars, like fully equipped train cars on the site, it was so big, you basically also lived at the factory. So you paid rent to the guy that was also giving you your paycheck. In 1893, which is something we will get to here in a little while, there was a severe economic depression, so he cut wages without also lowering rent in the housing he provided for his workers, which is the thing that I mentioned before. Needless to say, this pissed off a lot of people, so by the next year, there was a large strike. So the Pullman workers belonged to the American Railway Union, which was headed by Eugene V. Debs. He believed that organizing labor was a major part of workers' rights. Pullman didn't necessarily agree with this, but he also decided not to go the same route that Frick did and call in mercenaries. He realized that since his company was working with trains, he could claim that by disrupting his company's work, the strikers were disrupting train travel. And specifically, they were interfering with the delivery of U.S. mail by train. Now, that doesn't sound like that big a deal. I mean, heck, in the last couple of years, the U.S. government's been screwing with, like, mail delivery. But especially back then, and this isn't something we'll get to in this class, but in my technology course, one of the last things we talked about was the development of airplanes, and like the modern day federal, really everything over airplanes, and that was because of airmail. One of the first things that airplanes were used for was rapid delivery of mail over short distances, and because mail is a federal jurisdiction thing, the federal government got involved. They started building airports, radar beacons. They got involved in even like plane design. So one of the reasons why American aircraft development increased so rapidly in the early 1900s was because because delivering mail was a big deal for the American government, apparently. So to bring this idea of, well, they're interfering with the delivery of mail, and suddenly the government's like, oh crap, we have to get involved. So the federal government put an injunction on Debs and the other union officials by using the Sherman Antitrust Act. The thing that was supposed to be used against big businesses that harmed the overall economy by having monopolies. Well, instead they used it against this union that was trying to fight a big business. In fact, they used the policy to punish those who conspired to restrain trade, against the union that was trying to fight against a big company that basically had monopoly. Debs obviously refused and was arrested and sent to jail. So that's two things so far: the wage and rent being the same guy, and then also the use of mail to get the government involved. But a third thing, Debs wasn't done. In fact, we're going to talk about him again in a later chapter. He later formed the Socialist Party of America, which advocated for a peaceful democratic rise to power as opposed to a violent overthrow of the government, which was what Marx was about. Debs would stick around at least until about World War I, actually. Well, we'll see him here and there over the next few chapters. He never became like a huge name, but he does keep showing up. This wasn't like medieval Europe where somebody becomes important and then they get burned at the stake. So he did get thrown in jail a lot for, being a socialist. So here's that image again. Now you guys have the context of it, where he's pushing down the wages while keeping the rent where it is and squeezing every last penny out of his workers. Here's the strike itself. You can see these real huge buildings. I mean, they're actually really rather ornate buildings. But because they're building entire rail cars in them, where's my mouse? They're very large buildings. I don't know what has happened to this mouse. Some stuff was set on fire, as you can see here in this train yard. I'd be very concerned being on top of these things while they're blasting fire hoses into it, and again, stuff's on fire, but, you know, it was the 1800s. You do what you do. And there's the U.S. Army coming in to quiet things down. And by quiet things down, I mean shoot into crowds. Here are soldiers dispersing American Railway Union strikers and sympathizers at 49th Street in Chicago. You know, shooting into crowds in the middle of the streets. As you do. So those were the major strikes. That's a couple of chapters past where I need to be. Oh, there's a big thing on the Pullman strike. Okay. But there's one more big union to discuss. And that's the Industrial Workers of the World. Some of you may recall the IWW from some propaganda pictures I used last semester, because a lot of the names of some of the acts and laws put together were reused later on, and the IWW was specifically targeted. So, there was a major strike in the mines in Idaho, which formed the Western Federation of Miners. The IWW eventually emerged from this, also known as the Wobblies. I just don't know why they would use that terrible name, but again, it's the 1800s, so times were different, I guess. They wanted to raise wages, improve working conditions, and gain union recognition for the most exploited workers in the United States. You know, typical union stuff. I mean, the unions weren't all that different from one another in their broad ideas. They also wanted to unite all skilled and unskilled workers in an attempt to overthrow capitalism. They preferred strikes and direct action protests over bargaining and mediation. Their rallies would often also meet with government and corporation-inspired mob violence, because, you know, the government and corporations are also very good at just hurting people. But you could say the government's got a bit of a monopoly on that. Still, though, despite the violence they often faced, the IWW had a lot of appeal. I mean, calling themselves the Industrial Workers of the World may seem a little bit ambitious, but they did have broad appeal. The lumberjacks in the Northwest, dock workers in the ports, miners in the West, farmers in the Great Plains, textile workers in the Northeast. It says they carried out 150 strikes, with several actually being successful, because the strikes we've seen so far had not been successful. It just got a lot of people killed. Or, you know, and if they were lucky, thrown in jail. Because strikes didn't necessarily mean like shooting and burning and stuff. It just meant they would not go into work and pressure the company into their demands. Since the IWW had so many members, then their strikes tended to hold a lot more power. So here's their symbol. It's a lot more simple and concise than some of those other symbols we had before, with like the hands shaking across the world and the like the words going all the way around the thing, so half of it's upside down. This was a bit more concise. And although the book only talks about the IWW in the U.S., it's called Industrial Workers of the World, there was some actually international chapters. Here we have an Italian magazine. Now, granted, it's using an image from an American propaganda piece. IWW, you've got industrial unionism, this weird one-eyed capitalism octopus thing, child labor, poverty, wage slavery, prostitution, war. And here we have underneath Il Proletario, an Italian language IWW newspaper, borrowed graphics from Solidarity and the Industrial Pioneer. The editor would usually add a caption in Italian. The above caption reads, "Workers, give me more strength in my arm." This is a very like World War I style propaganda piece. It's really good. So, I mean, it's very, very obvious what it means. And again, like, you didn't even really need to be able to read all of this to know what was going on. So here we have the various protests and strikes, and, you know, the measured response of the government. Have the military go out and fix bayonets. Quite a few of those, actually. All right. So that's all well and good. Let's get into something a little less depressing than workers being shot by the troops. What the working class did when they weren't working themselves to death. So there was still time for leisure for the working class. While the time clock did make them closer to the machines they ran than people, really, it did delineate the work time from, well, the not work time. So once they punched out, that was it. They were off work. You know, when you were working at the farm, you were sort of always at work. You know, basically until the sun went down, and then once the sun went down, you pretty much went to bed. Men often attended sporting events. Women would often go to social gatherings. Since women's wages were very, very tiny compared to men's wages, because again, 1800s, well, and most of the 1900s, dating became a way to ensure that women would have a meal for the evening, which is kind of awful, which intermingled economic and emotional relationships. So they, you know, you'd go on a date to ensure you could eat for the evening, even if you were working. Um, Obviously, these leisure activities would be segregated along economic lines. You know, the rich folks would have other things that they would do besides what the working class would do. However, some things everybody was able to enjoy. So around 1900, we had the first amusement parks showing up in America. Coney Island in Brooklyn was where the world's first roller coaster was built in 1884. Chicago had the world's first Ferris wheel in the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, which was designed by George Ferris. I will actually read this out of the book. Designed by George Ferris, operated a firm specializing in structural steel. The wheel rose 250 feet in the air, was propelled by two 1,000 horsepower steam engines, accommodated 1,440 riders at a time. I've got an image of this thing. The best way I can, the thing that always stands out to me is that usually when you go back and look at the first version of old stuff, because like we'll look at very early race cars here in a minute. They look like toys. And like this first roller coaster, it's barely a thing. But then this first Ferris wheel is a monster. Like, modern day Ferris wheels, most Ferris wheels, I mean, sure we have some like super big ones which are just meant to be ridiculously large. But like most Ferris wheels today, the gondola, you can put in like what, 3, 4, maybe 5 people if you want to be crazy. But these gondolas were like the size of a small room. It was crazy. I'll show you that in just a minute. And one more thing, of course, music. Music evolved during this period. Banjos and fiddles, blues and jazz in the South, emergence of country music in mill towns. So, obviously, let's see, African Americans offered a popular destination for the musicians. They had various areas where they would put on shows. This also says here, Mountain Valley Milltown Southern white residents preferred old-time music, but with a twist. Originally enjoyed by British settlers, traditional ballads and folk songs concerned the deeds of kings and princes. Obviously, rural Southerners modified the lyrics to extol the exploits of outlaws and adventurers, which became essentially country music. Combined romantic ballads and folk tunes to accommodate guitars, banjos, and organs. So this became this new style of music. It's pretty neat. It's like, we're not going to sing about some British kings and princes. We're going to have our own heroes, but using this same style of music. All right. So we've got like late 1800s baseball, which, I don't know how much protection this floppy quilt will give you, but whatever. And, the stands are just kind of, you're under some corrugated plywood. Here's some folks riding their bikes in the tall grass. Don't worry about the snakes, it's fine. Or the ticks, really. That's what I'd be worried about. That's the grass you get ticks in. Here's some old race cars. Look at that. Now, see, at first I'd be worried because it's like, man, this is the sort of thing you turn and like the car explodes. But then you kind of realize, well, the engines weren't that strong. They were going like maybe 45. I mean, sure, you turn too hard and the wheels fall off, but you're going like 45. So it's not that big a deal, but those are still like bicycle wheels. There's folks out dancing. I don't know what's going on with that guy. I think he's had a bit too much to drink. Coney Island. This is a really good, like, promotional image I managed to find. Though this one doesn't have the roller coaster on it, so I don't know if it's an older promotional thing or if it's like, oh, the roller coaster, that's for kids. That's for the vacation and college kids or whatever. We're gonna be more high class than that. But here's the roller coaster. Which again, like today, it's like, okay, that's a couple of hills, whatever. If you've ever been on a wooden roller coaster, they're a very different experience than a steel roller coaster. Steel roller coaster, smooth. You've got your twists and your turns and your loops and whatever. A wooden roller coaster, it's like you're going down a gravel road with all four of your tires about to fall off. It's just the whole way down. Yeah, it'll knock something loose. It looks like they updated it here, because based on the cars down here, this is like the early to mid 1900s. So this must be an updated version of the roller coaster. I wonder what it looks like today, because I know they wouldn't have like completely removed it. It's so historic at this point. Also, here is that big Ferris wheel. Now, I mean, yeah, it looks relatively large here, but here it is compared right next to the people. So here's the people down here. Here's each gondola. It reminds me of like my aunt's sunroom at the back of her house. Like it's the size of, well, like I said, a small room. You could fit probably a dozen people in there. I mean, it's closed in. You could have, dinner while you're going around the Ferris wheel. It's massive. And also, your tunes, your bluegrass and your jazz. Some fine music there in the early 1900s, late 1800s. Do like me some jazz. All right. So, one more major group to discuss, and then we'll get towards the end of the chapter, and that should be it for the day. So, we mentioned that besides immigrants, farmers were a major group that moved to the factories as far as, the unskilled laborers. Well, obviously not all farmers could do that because we still needed farmers to grow food. So those that stayed behind were, excuse me, were fighting to really survive in this age of industrialization. The combine harvester was introduced in 1878, which caused production to rise, but unfortunately that only really helped those who could afford said harvester, because if production rises, the market gets flooded and the price per unit, of, say, grain, or, well, I guess it'd be price per pound, drops. So if you've just got a little farm, your profit's going to drop. So many farmers took out loans to buy these machines so that their productivity could go up, so they could, well, obviously produce more to try to regain their lost profit. But since a lot of farmers were doing this, it flooded the market even more, which drove prices down even more. This wasn't, I always like to compare it to, well, it used to be Harvest Moon, now it's Stardew Valley, where it's like, no matter what the no matter what year it is, one, I don't know, tomato is worth the same amount all the time. You don't have competing farmers. You don't have to worry about global market prices. It's always the same. In the real world, it's not that way. And you can't survive on your own with a little plot of land. And another thing, and this is what's going to drive the changes here, is because these farms need a lot of land to run this production, they were very, very secluded. Your neighbor would be miles away just due to how much land you had to have and how much land your neighbor had to have in order to farm enough to survive. Your houses would be miles apart, which I know for some of us that sounds like a great deal, but it meant that, you know, if farmers raising kids, their children would only had their parents to deal with, and for some of us that sounds like a nightmare. So many children would leave to go to the cities to look for opportunities, and would further increase the solitude of these farmers. So this first shift in farmer organization was to try to counteract this solitude among farmers and allow for some level of social interaction and cultural engagement. So as far back as 1867, I mean, this is like right after the Civil War, Oliver H. Kelly formed the Patrons of Husbandry, set up lectures, agricultural fairs, and picnics. They were known as the Grangers, which is the French word for a granary, which is, if you can't tell from the name, that's where you put your grain. It's very important for a farm. Organization grew rapidly, 14,000 new chapters between 1872 and 1874. That is obscene. 14,000 chapters in 2 years. Now, this is, I don't know exactly how directly these links are tied, but the idea of agricultural fairs and picnics where these farmers come together and like socialize, that to me sounds a lot like when you look at a county fair. You know, you've got your poorly built rides, you know, like the Ferris wheel, your questionable food, but off in the corner you've got the barn with the cattle and the sheep and the stinky pigs, and you've got some group that comes together and like judges the animals based on some criteria, and that like traces its roots back to this. So these ideas from like 150 years ago still persist to this day, which is kind of cool. In fact, actually, as we're going to see, a lot of ideas that these folks came up with, even though the groups themselves don't persist, their ideas did. So as the Grangers became more organized, they set up farm cooperatives to sell their crops at higher prices, which is to say, they would agree to not sell until the market basically no longer had, again, say, grain on the market, and then the demand went up, and then they would sell it all at once so that they would all get a higher price for it. They would pool funds to buy goods at wholesale prices so they wouldn't get, you know, scammed at department stores. So all of this led to increased political involvement. Now, they didn't form their own party. Specifically, the Grangers didn't. Again, we'll get to that in a little bit. But they did back those that supported their interest, which did lead to some legislation going their way. So while they weren't specifically in politics, they were now more informed more organized and better able to make their voice heard. So this was a good thing for the farmers. So I've got this image here of just some family out in the West. I don't know what's going on with this like turnip child over here. It looks like she was just pulled out of the dirt by her hair. I feel like a turnip child's the least weird thing I've seen in the Midwest. Just to give you an idea of how rapidly things changed, here's your typical plow that you pull behind a mule. You know, it opens the earth so you can plant the seeds. And this is the combine harvester. Also, there's the tractor. I'll talk about the tractor in just a moment. So the harvester here, well, it's called a combine harvester because it's got both the harvester and the thresher. So the harvester, well, harvests. It gets the it chops it cuts the wheat and throws the stalks into the back. The thresher part actually removes the chaff from the wheat and dumps it out back. That's what you see back here. This is all the waste product of the wheat. So you only have the grain left inside. So you don't have to do all that work by hand, which would take days. Now, going back up here, this isn't quite like a tractor you'd see today. Any guess on how this is different than a tractor you'd see today? I mean, besides the tire. Yeah, why is it, I mean, you just like looking at how this is all shaped. What does that look like? What does that kind of remind you of? That's right. What's it powered by? It's a steam-powered tractor. This thing's heavy as hell, and it's not all that strong compared to a gasoline-powered tractor today. So they rarely actually use these to pull these things because they were so heavy, they'd often get bogged down in the dirt. So most of the time, if a farmer actually bought one of these, they'd park it and hook it up to the harvester and use it to run the crankshaft to actually just run the machine to do the thresher bit. If they actually were pulling it through the field, they'd usually just hook it up to a team of horses or oxen. But yeah, this was mostly just used for the engine part. Very rarely did they try and run it through, because the few times I've seen one of these actually out in a field, it's about up to here in mud. Yeah, these were heavy. I've seen maybe one or two of them in real life, like in antique shows and stuff. And they were very rare. I'll just say that. All right. There's the Patrons of Husbandry symbol. Again, there's a lot going on. You got your wheat. Because again, when you would harvest wheat, you'd tie them into bundles and just sort of toss them aside because you'd come back later to pick them up. And this was really the only part you cared about, because all this down here is just extra. It was a whole process. This is, I was just telling my class yesterday, it's like I like to imagine this guy isn't just in the foreground. This is actually like Paul Bunyan style giant just hanging out. But what this is meant to represent is like Thomas Jefferson's agrarian paradise for America. This is what Thomas Jefferson envisioned for America, is where the farmers were the ones that really were in control, and America remains this pure agrarian, to use the word again, this pure agrarian paradise. This image is in the book. So, I will read this from top left around, and then of course we'll get to the middle in a moment. So starting with the top left, you've got a lawyer, and it looks like a I rule for all. I guess that's either a judge or maybe a congressman. So you've got I plead for all, I rule for all. Below them, obviously the trains. I carry for all. I bull and bear for all. I don't know, stock market. I fleeced you all. They didn't care for bankers. This one's weird. I physic you all. Singular, physic. I buy and sell for all. So yeah, merchants. I sell for all. Cool. I fight for all. I pray for all. Great. And then here in the middle you have I feed you all, which, yeah, I think that's important. But the farmers tend to get the short end of the stick with like everything. I mean, those of you that were here with me last semester, which again, most of you, farmers tended to always be getting the worst end of everything. I mean, heck, if you guys take my 103 and 104, where we're in Europe from like the start of human history, the farmers are always getting the worst of it. But they are the foundation on which we build our society. And, or sorry, I shouldn't say society, civilization. And yet, they're treated poorly. And that's what the Grangers were, trying to address. So this is a pretty nice image depicting that. Even if it's being a little anti-Semitic here, it's like, Jewish bankers. Because of course. All right. So the next step was the farmers' alliances. Oops, actually a bit further along. Okay, so the Interstate Commerce Act is not technically part of this, but it's in the middle of the notes, and I wanted to include this just to show how easily these acts and things that were meant to regulate the big businesses were, how easily they could be corrupted. So, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act, which established the Interstate Commerce Commission. Cool. Which meant to regulate the railroads. This was to make it so that, like we saw previously, where the big railroads would give special rebates to the big businesses so that they could ship things for cheaper, while the smaller businesses basically would have to pay so much that it would run them out of business. It was a deal that made them a lot of money. However, advocates of major railway lines soon were on the Interstate Commerce Commission board and were passing laws in favor of the big railways as opposed to the small local shippers, and were destroying the small local railways. Because that's all it takes, is just a couple of people in favor of the other side to just like get on the board and run things the way they want to run them, even if the laws were meant to go the other direction. I mean, again, the 14th Amendment was used within like 10 years to make corporations people. So anyway, back to the Grangers. By the late 1880s, Grangers began pulling out of politics and were replaced by a series of farmers' alliances. Now, let me clarify this. The Grangers and the farmers' alliances are technically two different groups. This is a break between the two. But they are so similar in their goals and what they want to achieve that I'm going to draw a line between them. Now, if you do a paper on them, or if you talk to someone who specifically studies them, they're going to be like, oh no, they're completely different. They came from completely different places. But they have the same goals, and they have a lot of the same DNA. And for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to say that the Grangers and the Farmers Alliances are kind of the same thing. So I'm going to be a little bit wrong here for the sake of simplicity. I just want to let you guys know that in advance. So the Grangers technically pull out of politics, and the Farmers Alliances technically replace them, but they're really close to being the same thing. Milton George set up the Northwest Farmers Alliance in the Great Plains. Dr. Charles W. McCune set up the larger Southern Farmers Alliance. They had more than 4 million members. They, of course, excluded African Americans because, obviously. But they would not be excluded and set up their own Colored Farmers Alliance and held 250,000 members. So they're like, screw it, we'll do it ourselves. And they did. And one recruiter for these farmers' alliances was Mary Elizabeth Lease, advocated for the fight against capitalist exploitation and also for women's rights because, you know, why not? So one of the big goals for these farmers' alliances was a sub-treasury system. This would be the U.S. Treasury would store crops and take federal loans, wait for the price to go up, and then redeem their crops and sell them for higher prices. This is just a much larger version of what the Grangers were already doing, where they would hold their crops until the prices went up and then sell them. This was just on a massive scale. So again, this is why I'm saying it's like, this is like the Grangers, but bigger. Here's another horrifying snake thing. I promise this was way before Thomas the Tank Engine, but we already had some horrible monster version of him. So, Choo Choo Charles is not original. I like that they're using the whole train there. So this is the train monopoly opposing the Interstate Commerce Commission. Obviously, the ICC passed anyway, but it didn't matter because then the train monopolies took it over regardless. And here we have the Farmers Alliance in Texas, the most good for the most people, wisdom, justice, and moderation. A little bit dramatic for a Farmers Alliance, but then again, they were pretty powerful by the end of it. A little bit of the old Liberty. All right. So, 1889, they wanted to merge these alliances, Northwestern and Southern alliances, as well as joining with the Knights of Labor, because they're still around. I mean, they were weakened after the Haymarket Square incident, but they didn't disappear. As well as bringing in the Colored Farmers Alliance, because again, the Southern Farmers Alliance might have been racist, but the Knights of Labor were cool with, well, everybody but the Chinese. So the National Farmers Alliance and Industrial Union met in Ocala, Florida, to try and gain more power for the plain people, which is to say, industrial workers. Tariff reduction, governmental ownership of banks and railroads, direct election of U.S. senators, which wasn't a thing, adoption of the secret ballot, which again wasn't a thing yet. Like, it's weird seeing these as new ideas. Provisions for voters to initiate and decide public issues, which again wasn't a thing yet. So, like, public concerns that you actually voted on weren't a thing. Also, they wanted the government to expand silver coinage because the inflation would help pay off their pre-inflation debts. That one caused an issue as far as what the government wanted to do. Eastern bankers that supplies the loans opposed the measure because the bankers who supplied the loans wanted the loans to be paid back at pre-inflation rates. The Congress, led by Senator John Sherman, halted the purchase of more silver by the Treasury Department. So the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, silver purchasing continued, but there was no guarantee how much would be made into currency because, again, it doesn't matter how much gold or silver the government has, only that which is made into currency counts as, well, currency, obviously. Some alliance members wanted to use paper money to expand the currency because, again, paper money is this weird, nebulous thing. However, a big group that they needed to have on their side were the silver miners in the West, and the silver miners would not want paper money because they needed the silver price to remain high, so they needed to use silver coinage. So they emphasized silver coinage. Obviously, the demands were not met, so they formed their own political party, known as the Populist Party. We'll talk about that specifically on the next slide. After we go through some rather amazing images. Like this. Where the Free Coinage Act would, I guess, drown Colombia, which again is just the personification of America. But like specifically, where's my mouse? Our credit. Oh no. I don't know why this dude has like mouse. Where are you? Over here. I don't know why this dude has like a KFC chicken bucket on his head. And then there's going to be one we're going to look at in a minute where there's this dude with this long beard. We might get to it today. All right, so Populists. The National Farmers Alliance, which was the combined everybody Farmers Alliance, created the People's Party of America, which simply became known as the Populists. A lot better became known as than the International Workers of the World, or sorry, Industrial Workers of the World. I always want to call it International Workers of the World, which is a bit much. Better than being known as the Wobblies. Adopted a number of recommendations. Endorsed a graduated income tax, which imposed higher tax rates on higher income levels. Favored the 8-hour workday. Wanted to ban the use of Pinkerton mercenaries for labor disputes. Yeah, I feel like you should probably ban the people that are just meant to come in and shoot your people. Wanted to restrict immigration that reduced the number of unskilled laborers in the market, which itself drove down wages. You know, stuff that's still like a thing today. Which, again, just to remind you guys, Pinkertons still exist. So, you know, I'm sure we'll have people wanting to put that back on the laws before too long. Why don't we just have Pinkertons come in and, you know, shoot strikers? Like the good old days. They also pushed for women's suffrage due to the help of women like Mary Lease. And while African Americans were a major part of the founding of the populace, there was no specific proposal for reducing racial discrimination. They focused on relieving the plight of the worker regardless of ethnicity. So, we're helping everybody. It's fine. So they chose the former Union Civil War General, James B. Weaver. Now, he came in third place out of 3, but he did get more than 1 million popular votes, 22 electoral votes, and for a third party showing up for the first time, that was actually really good. And I mean, in an election when the population of America was like, I don't know, 5 million, 10 million, to get 1 million votes was not bad at all. As far as the state level, Populous got 10 congressional representatives, 5 senators, 3 governors, and 1,500 state legislatures. So again, not bad. And then at the midterm, they had a 42% increase in people voting for their candidates. So it looked like the Populists were doing pretty good. We're all very familiar with the third party, the Populist Party, that's a major part of our political system today. They did really well, and they're still around. This image is in the book. Here lies prosperity, enslaved in 1863, stabbed in the back in 1873, and assassinated in 1893 by John Sherman, Grover Cleveland, and other traitors in Congress. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Here is the idea that free coinage would clear the path for decent people to the White House. Didn't quite work that way, but, Other folks had a less generous view of the Populist Party. So here we have the People's Party, Old Granger Party, which, like I said, I clearly wasn't the only one drawing that line. Knights of Labor, they were there. Socialists, I think so. Free Silver Party, yes. Prohibition Party, the book never specifies, but considering women were a major part of the farmers' alliances and women were usually the ones behind the Prohibition, probably. Farmers' Alliance, yes. Old Greenback Party, I don't know. Again, the book doesn't specify, and I don't even really know who the old Greenbacks were, so whatever. Communists, anybody that works with labor unions were considered communists, so sure, why not? Anarchists, same as before. Oh, you work with labor unions, you're just a bunch of anarchists. Just like Mr. Big Beard here. All right, I'm going to go just a bit further so we can be a little closer to my other class before I let you guys go. Because then this happened. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad exploded in 1893, which put a quarter of American railroads into bankruptcy, which then itself crashed the economy, which then in itself collapsed the stock market. Europe was already dealing with economic issues, so they had been pulling money out of American stocks. So when people went to the banks to get their money out, there was no money there because they had been using European money. So the gold was already gone. So the banks crashed, and the farmers had been relying on banks for credit to run their farms. So the farms now had no money. So the farmers basically all went bankrupt. It all happened really fast. Like we all think of, oh, the Great Depression. It was by no means the only time that's ever happened. And neither was this. Again, those of you that were here last semester, which again, most of you, it seemed like this happened every couple of decades. I mean, really, the only reason we didn't have one every couple of decades in the 1900s was the military-industrial complex kind of artificially keeping us buoyed. So Grover Cleveland made this worse by a great degree. There was great agitation among the unemployed. Some people, including the president, were worried that it would create another rebellion, which is to say, another civil war. In 1894, Jacob Coxey, a populist from Ohio, led a march on Washington. He just got up and decided he was going to walk to Washington from Ohio, which is to say he and some of his boys. And on the way there, more people joined him, and by the time he got to Washington, there were about 500 folk with him. He demanded that Cleveland and Congress create a federal public works program to provide jobs for the unemployed. He was a few decades ahead of things, because this is exactly what FDR would do in the Great Depression. Like he was asking Cleveland to do what FDR would do in the 1930s. Coxey was turned away and arrested for trespassing. So, and this would be, according to the book, also disregarded protesters participating in nearly 20 other marches on Washington. So the people basically saw Cleveland as being completely useless in fixing this thing. The War of Wealth. There's Coxey and his boys. I actually got a number of images of this. And the best one, because it's got a dog. Look at that dog just flopped out. And then this one from Puck. I swear that's a P. Alright, we will talk about Cleveland making things worse next week, because today's Wednesday, isn't it? I'll see you guys on Monday. We'll finish the chapter up and move on to the next one on Monday.